Hello, my name is Rain and welcome to my channel, Radiscus Fantasy Formula 1. I've just finished up my watch-along for Free Practice 1 and Free Practice 2. If you missed it, do not fret. I do believe we will be doing this again. It was a lot of fun. We watched FP1, played some games in between, and then watched FP2, and I think I'll do it for Azerbaijan's Grand Prix in 2 weeks' time. So if you want to join in on that next time and you have Friday off, or you want something to watch at work or in the morning or wherever you are in the world, make sure you follow me on Twitch. Link is in the description below, as I'm exclusively live there for watch along and such, as this channel is mainly for deadline streams and these types of videos. Well, a lot of things happened in Free Practice 1 and 2, a lot of things that we need to discuss. This was my team from last week. What am I planning to do with it with my 2 free transfers? Well, we discussed a lot about 4A potentially being dead. I wouldn't say it's dead this time around. I think if you can stretch to a team with Piastri, Leclerc, or Hamilton, McLaren, Ferrari, I think that's going to be really strong, but it also obviously depends on what cheap assets you can afford with it, as the 2 cheapest assets in the game right now are Pierre Gasly at 4.8 and Franco Colapinto at 4.5, and I'm not super excited about owning either of them at the moment. So if you are at the point where you have a budget where you can get Hadjar, Lawson, Bortoletto, and then double Ferrari, double McLaren, I do think that could be the strongest available team. Granted, I'm not anywhere close to that type of budget. If you are, congrats. If you can get to that with a wild card, fantastic. I think you should go for it. For us regular humans, though, that don't have a crazy budget, we have a lot of options to make. Williams looked really good in practice, as sort of expected. Williams have scored almost as many points this year in the Constructors Championship as they have over the last 7 years total. And during those last 2 years, they have looked pretty good in Monza with their straight line speed. They've sort of been notorious for being the team to sort of lead the DRS trains. They don't really need the DRS to go fast. They have a really good straight line speed. And we've seen that so far in Free Practice with Carlos Sainz being top 3 in both sessions. So I'm very interested in Williams. We also saw Ferrari being really fast in FP1. FP2, they still looked good, but McLaren sort of caught up a little bit, or at least showed their true strength. Norris was the fastest on the straights, so I would imagine that we're still looking at a McLaren 1-2 finish. And the reason why that's important, because you might say like, oh, of course that was going to happen. The reason why that's important is that I don't think a triple McLaren plus cheap constructor build is good unless McLaren are heavy favorites for P1, P2. Because the reason we downgrade a second constructor, which usually gives us a lot of points if we get the second best one, and if I do expect Ferrari to be the second best scoring constructor this time around, but even with that, I think a build with McLaren Williams specifically can outscore McLaren Ferrari Piastri teams. Just, you need McLaren to lock down those P1, P2 positions. Obviously, they didn't last time around because Norris had that DNF. But, they were on track to be a really, really... it was on track to be a really, really strong lineup in Sandwords. So, because I do still think, even though they weren't 1-2 in practice or anything like that, I still think with the pace in that car, I still think McLaren are favorites to go P1, P2, but I do expect Ferrari to be favorites for P3 and potentially P4 depending. The reason why that's depending is because Hamilton obviously has a grid penalty. I don't think I discussed that enough in my team selection video. That's not really for me to buy. I'm not going to go out and buy Hamilton. If you're on a potential wildcard and want to take a risk, maybe you can go for that. If the Ferrari's fast, Hamilton starts maybe P9, P10 after the penalty and then climbs up to like a P4, P5. If it's boring at the front, that could be enough for a driver of the day. I also think the favorite for driver of the day this time around is going to be Charles Leclerc, because I think he's favorite for P3. And if there's not anything else exciting happening at the front of the pack, I do think Leclerc at a P3 could be enough for driver of the day. And in that case, he could be on for like a 40-pointer. So I do think something like Piastri, that's why I talked previously about Piastri Leclerc being really strong with McLaren Ferrari. For my team, though, I have only 2 free transfers, and looking ahead slightly, I do think that I will want to have a 4A lineup for Singapore, a track with low overtakes. We've seen when these B tier, midfield drivers and constructors can get a lot of positions gained, get a lot of overtakes, that that really heavily skews the points in their favor, and thus enables strategies like the ones we used in Zandvoort. But if it's more of a locked race like Singapore tends to be, I'm expecting something like, again, double McLaren, double Ferrari, or double McLaren, Russell Ferrari is going to be the strongest available lineup there. So that is sort of what I'm aiming for. I want to be able to get to a 4A lineup in Singapore with free transfers if possible. So I was initially looking at maybe only making one transfer this week, but I think it's okay to make 2 transfers here and then 1 in Azerbaijan. And the reason for that is because obviously Monza is the temple of speed. Straight line speed is very important. But then after that we go to Azerbaijan, that has the longest straight in on the calendar. So Azerbaijan is also a track where the biggest overtaking opportunity comes at the end of that long straight into turn 1, meaning that your top speed is really important in Azerbaijan as well. So if you make 2 transfers and use up, or 3 transfers if you have 3 available, and use up all of them here, I do expect that the same sort of teams that are viable here in Monza will be viable in Azerbaijan as well. Meaning that in Azerbaijan, then, if you have a good team in Monza, you can probably get away with only making 1 or no transfer, for that matter, in Azerbaijan. And then that leaves you with 3 free transfers to shake up your team for Singapore if you want to move to the 4A lineup there. I know we keep pushing up that 4A jump off, I suppose, but Singapore feels right to me at the moment. But we're here to talk about Monza. And, in Monza right now, based on what happened in free practice 1 and 2, I have 2 options. I have 2 options in front of me that I could go for. One is to get Ferrari back because Ferrari looked good, right? Ferrari looked fine. I'm interested in getting Ferrari. And if I get Ferrari in, the only reasonable option I have to sell is Lando Norris, which I would be fine selling. And that would leave 14.7 million in the bank, which means I could get any B-tier asset that isn't Kimi Antonelli. Not that I would want Kimi Antonelli anyway. And that would, of course, be Alex Albon. I think you could get a Carlos Sainz here, but when I can afford Albon, I think you should go for Albon. Sainz has shown promise in practice sessions earlier this year and just not really delivered, whereas Albon, his track record this season speaks for itself. Obviously, I'm not expecting a 27-pointer, but a 10-plus pointer is sort of what I come to expect from Albon at this point. And if you can stretch an Albon, I think Albon is really good. I'm not a super massive fan of keeping Stroll and Alonso here, but I'm going to go by my own philosophy of not taking a -10 just to change a cheap asset around. So in this instance, I would go to Ferrari, get Albon, keep Stroll and Alonso. Then I could make 1 transfer to anything, switching one of my cheap assets around to whichever looked best. Maybe Aston Martin looked bad, and I want to sell Stroll or Alonso to a Sainz, or a Hadjar, or a Bearman, or whatever in Azerbaijan. Make sure I have enough budget, and then I could do 3 free transfers to sort of get the cheapest assets available to upgrade to a 4A lineup in Singapore, right? So that is plan 1. It's a good plan. I think it's a really good plan if you want to go for Ferrari. I do think a team, I don't know, such as this maybe is going to be a really, really powerful team if you're already on the Ferrari build. Of course, again, you could definitely go for Carlos Sainz as well, leave 10 million in the bank, free up funds that way. If you could go for Norris, Piastri, McLaren, Ferrari, you're crazy. That would also be really good, of course. But my personal second option is if I want to keep McLaren triple up, I'm okay with going against Ferrari and Monza. That seems crazy to say, but I'm not gonna own Leclerc or Hamilton in any situation, which means the driver of the day going to them doesn't really matter for me. It's not really in my calculations of what I'm gonna go for. So the other option would be to sell Stroll and Aston Martin, switching Aston Martin to Williams and not go for Ferrari there. And then the Stroll downgrade, which I would need to be able to afford to upgrade Aston Martin to Williams. I can't just go with one move and save my transfers immediately. Initially, I was thinking of going for Hadjar here, But just because of how good Williams look, I would be kind of down to just go Carlos Sainz here and double up. Again, I care more about points than budget, so I don't really care about where Sainz sits budget-wise. If Williams are, the data behind Williams and their long-run pace look as good as they did on positions for fastest lap in free practice 1 and 2, I'm definitely interested in Carlos Sainz there. So I think those two are my options. Again, this could, of course, be Hadjar. They're the same price. But those are my two options going into this. What that essentially boils down to is it's going to be, if we assume that Stroll and Hadjar or Stroll and Sainz score the same points, which I don't even think is necessarily the case. I think the Hadjar or Sainz upgrade is sort of similar. It sort of comes down to like a Norris versus Ferrari discussion with the extra Williams assets in there, because obviously I would have Albon on the other one. So it's kind of like Norris and Sainz versus Leclerc and Hamilton. Which combo scores the most? This would obviously be without the 2x, within the calculation. But that's kind of where my decision is at. Do I go for Norris, Sainz, and Sainz? Because it would be double Sainz, because I would have Sainz on the constructor and Sainz on the driver. Let's assume Sainz is here. To make it easier, let's just say it's Hadjar, okay? Actually, Sainz is the better, the better option, I think, so far. He's above, so this would be Norris, Sainz, and Sainz, basically both, Sainz points times two. Norris, Sainz, and Sainz versus Leclerc, Hamilton, Stroll. Which one of those two do you think is best? Leclerc, Hamilton, Stroll, and obviously that's without driver of the day going to Leclerc or Hamilton, because I would get their points from the constructor and not the driver asset. So Leclerc, Hamilton, or Stroll, or Norris, Sainz, and Sainz. What would you pick? I'm leaning Norris, Sainz, and Sainz right now, but I haven't decided. The last thing I want to discuss is sort of the argument between Norris versus Piastri 2x on triple McLaren builds. This is the elite data site on F1 Fantasy Tools, where you can see what the top 500 in the Patreon League or the global top 500 are like what kind of teams they're running, right? I prefer to look at the Patreon 500 because I think a lot of the global 500 has used all of their chips. Meanwhile, if you look at the Patreon 500, only 20% of them have used their 3x, which means that they're playing optimally, they're holding off, they're going to go for the optimal strategy in a sprint weekend at the end of the season. And you can see here that after last week, there's a large change in what the Patreon 500 did. I mean, 74% of people sold Ferrari, which is crazy, and then they got a double DNF. We've been so lucky with that this season. But you could also see that Norris jumped up by 33.8%, so a third of people on the top 500 patron bought Norris, which means that we're now at 98.6% of people having Piastri and 57% having Norris. I would wager that the 1.4% of people that don't have Piastri are running like single Norris builds, if that makes sense, like just Norris and not Piastri, which I think, sure, that's a way to play the game. But I think majority of Norris owners, let's say 55% at least, have Norris and Piastri. And then you look at the 2x data for Norris, and that's at 37.2%. So if we assume that most Norris owners also have Piastri, that would mean that by a quite significant margin, almost 2/3 of people that have Norris and Piastri have put the 2x on Norris. And my argument before was when you buy Norris and when you have both of them, you should put the 2x on Norris because he's the differential, because Piastri is owned by 100% of people. And yes, that was true when Norris was only owned by like 10%. Now that Norris is owned by over half the player base, or the elite player base, I should say, it actually might be the opposite, right? Obviously, I think is going to shift more towards Piastri being the set and forget 2x. But one argument is that a lot of people who are on Piastri and Norris put the 2x on Norris, so you're kind of differentiating yourself from the other people that are on the triple McLaren strategy by putting the 2x on Piastri. And also, Piastri's been so safe this season and just a really solid asset in general, whereas Norris feels more like a higher ceiling, lower floor type of driver. Again, he tops Piastri in practice, but we've seen what happens before when he does that. I honestly don't know what the correct answer is. Some of you are going to say, just do it on Piastri, man. But majority of people with both still put it on Norris last time around. And all you need, I think Norris owners have been unlucky compared to Piastri owners. Because when Norris has won races, Piastri has usually been the one to pick up fastest lap, which means that Piastri has matched Norris' score, even though Norris went on to win the race. And whereas that's not really been the case when Piastri has been the winner, and also Norris has obviously had those 2 DNFs, which has really hurt owners. So I do think Norris owners have been a bit unlucky. I think for me right now, if I were to have both and I go for the for this option, right, it's literally a 50-50, and I would have to look at FP3 and then decide tomorrow during the deadline stream, which is of course back both on YouTube and on Twitch 2 hours before the deadline, 2 hours before qualifying. Make sure you don't miss that. A lot of things can also change in FP3. Nothing is set in stone, as always with these videos. But yeah, I think best lineup is going to be something like Norris, Piastri, McLaren, Ferrari, if you can fit that in there with cheap assets. That's crazy high budget. If you can't fit that, I do think Piastri, Leclerc, McLaren, Ferrari with good cheap assets is going to be really strong as well. If you can't fit in that, I think it's kind of a toss-up between whether this is going to be the best or the team I showed you earlier with Albon plus Ferrari. And I do think that's more budget-friendly as well for those of you who are on like 125-ish million. So that's going to be it for this video. I'll see you tomorrow on the deadline stream. Thank you so much for watching. Like the video if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to hit 5K subscribers before the end of the season. It would mean the world to me if we could hit that number, because of course, as you all know, bigger number, better person. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.